Some stories begin with wealth, others begin with nothing, but the most powerful stories begin when two worlds collide, when privilege meets poverty, when judgment meets grace, when the one who had everything learns from the one who had nothing. This is not just a story about a dog. This is a story about what it means to see value where others see waste, to find salvation where others see filth, and to discover that heroes don't always wear designer clothes or carry expensive bags. Sometimes heroes have four legs and a heart that refuses to forget kindness, even when kindness was never shown to them. This is the story of Victoria Ashford and a nameless stray who would become her unlikely savior, a tale of prejudice, redemption, and the searing truth that compassion cannot be bought, only earned. Victoria Ashford's heels clicked against marble floors with the precision of a metronome, each step a declaration of power, each movement a reminder of the empire she commanded. At 42, she had built an investment firm that moved millions daily, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and drove a custom black Mercedes that purred like a panther through the city streets. Her penthouse overlooked the skyline, a glass tower where she could watch the world below without ever having to touch it. She prided herself on efficiency. Time was money. Sentiment was weakness. Every decision she made was calculated, every relationship transactional. Her assistant knew better than to schedule meetings after 6. Her driver understood that silence was golden. Even her family had learned that Victoria's affection came with conditions: success, achievement, perfection. Nothing less would do. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Victoria emerged from her favorite boutique on Fifth Avenue, 3 shopping bags hanging from her arm, when she encountered something that disrupted her perfectly ordered world. A dog, if you could call it that, sat near the entrance, matted fur hanging in clumps, one ear torn, ribs visible through mangy coat. The animal's eyes were amber, intelligent, but its body told a story of streets and survival. The stray had been drawn to the warmth emanating from the store's heating vents. It didn't approach Victoria, didn't beg or whine. It simply sat there, watching the parade of humanity with an expression that might have been hope or might have been resignation. When Victoria stepped toward her car, the dog shifted slightly, and for one brief moment their eyes met. Victoria's lip curled in disgust. "Filthy creature," she muttered, pulling her coat tighter as if the dog's poverty might somehow contaminate her. Her driver, Marcus, had already stepped forward to shoo the animal away, but Victoria held up a hand. "Don't touch it. God knows what diseases it carries. Just get me to the car." As Marcus opened her door, a young woman, college-aged, wearing a university sweatshirt, approached the stray with a paper bag from a nearby deli. She knelt down, utterly unconcerned about the dirt staining her jeans, and offered the dog a sandwich. The animal took it gently, almost politely, and the young woman smiled, running her hand over the matted head. "You're going to get fleas," Victoria called out, unable to stop herself. The young woman looked up, her expression neither angry nor defensive, just sad. "Maybe," she replied softly. "But he's going to get breakfast." Victoria's jaw tightened. She slid into her leather seat without another word, but as Marcus pulled away from the curb, she found herself glancing back at the scene in her side mirror, the girl and the dog, 2 beings who apparently had nothing better to do than waste time on pointless compassion. That image should have faded within minutes. Victoria had a conference call at 10, a lunch meeting with investors at noon, and a charity gala that evening where she would write a check for 5 figures while barely remembering the cause. But somehow, irrationally, the picture of that stray dog lingered in her mind like a smudge on pristine glass. By evening she had forgotten it entirely, or so she told herself. The charity gala was held at the Grandview Hotel, a glittering affair where Manhattan's elite gathered to demonstrate their philanthropic credentials, while networking over champagne that cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in a month. Victoria arrived in a midnight blue gown, diamonds at her throat, her presence commanding attention the moment she entered the ballroom. She made the rounds with practiced efficiency, smiling at the right people, laughing at mediocre jokes, extracting business cards from potential clients with surgical precision. The cause tonight was something about homeless youth programs. Victoria had barely glanced at the brochure. Her publicist had selected this event because it photographed well and attracted the right demographic. "Mrs. Ashford," a voice interrupted her conversation with a hedge fund manager. Victoria turned to find a slight woman in her 50s, wearing a simple black dress that was elegant but clearly not designer. The woman's name tag identified her as Sarah Chen, program director. "I wanted to thank you personally for your generous donation tonight. The work we do wouldn't be possible without supporters like you." Victoria offered her professional smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, it's important to give back." The phrase rolled off her tongue automatically, rehearsed and hollow. Sarah nodded, but something in her expression suggested she'd heard that particular emptiness many times before. "We're currently expanding our services to include companion animal programs," Sarah continued undeterred. "Studies show that homeless youth with pets are more likely to seek help because they want better lives for their animals. We're opening a shelter within a shelter where they can keep their dogs while getting back on their feet." Victoria's smile tightened imperceptibly. How progressive. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Sarah recognized the dismissal, offered one more polite thank you and moved away. The hedge fund manager chuckled once she was gone. "Can you imagine? Homeless people with pets, as if they don't have enough problems without taking on responsibility for an animal." Victoria laughed, agreeing without really thinking about it. But later, as she stood on the hotel's terrace smoking a cigarette she would never admit to in public, that morning's image returned. The stray dog with amber eyes, the girl who knelt in the dirt, the gentle way the animal had taken the sandwich. She crushed the cigarette beneath her heel, annoyed at herself. Sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had built her empire by making hard decisions, by understanding that the world was divided into winners and losers, the valuable and the worthless. A stray dog was worthless by definition. No pedigree, no purpose, no owner willing to claim it. That was simply how the hierarchy worked. What Victoria didn't know, couldn't have known as she returned to the gala, was that hierarchy is an illusion we construct to feel safe. And sometimes the universe has a way of shattering our illusions in the most unexpected, most terrifying, and most beautiful ways imaginable. The stray dog, meanwhile, had found a spot beneath a downtown overpass, curled against the cold, dreaming whatever dogs dream when they have nothing but still refuse to give up hope. The city contained multitudes, penthouses and alleys, galas and soup kitchens, Victoria Ashfords and nameless strays. For 3 days after their brief encounter, their worlds continued on parallel tracks, never quite intersecting, but somehow orbiting the same truth. Survival requires more than strength. It requires the will to keep moving forward when everything suggests you should lie down and quit. Victoria's week proceeded with mechanical precision. She closed a deal worth $8 million, fired an underperforming analyst without a second thought, and purchased a weekend home in the Hamptons that she would visit perhaps twice a year. Her therapist, a necessity for maintaining the appearance of self-awareness that her social circle required, asked if she was happy. Victoria found the question absurd. Happiness was for people who had time to feel things. She had empires to build. The stray, whom the neighborhood had begun calling Chance, though he wore no collar and answered to no name, navigated a different kind of empire, one of territory and hierarchy, of knowing which restaurant would throw out edible scraps and which would call animal control. He had learned to avoid certain streets where teenagers threw rocks, to trust the elderly woman who left water bowls outside her apartment building, to sleep with one eye always open. Chance had not always been astray. Somewhere in the blurred memories of his puppyhood, there had been a home, a boy who threw tennis balls, a woman who scratched behind his ears, a place where he belonged. But circumstances change, families move, and sometimes dogs get left behind. He didn't understand abandonment in the way humans do, with their complex narratives of betrayal and loss. He simply understood that the home was gone, and so he adapted, because that is what survivors do. On Thursday afternoon, Victoria's car passed through the same neighborhood where Chance had made his temporary territory. She was on her phone, reviewing quarterly projections, when something made her glance up. There, standing in front of a bodega, accepting a piece of ham from the owner, was the stray. The same matted coat, the same amber eyes, the same dignity despite obvious hardship. Marcus slowed for a red light, and Victoria found herself staring. The bodega owner was speaking to the dog in Spanish, laughing as Chance wagged his tail. A small moment of connection, insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe, but somehow luminous in its simplicity. The light changed. Marcus drove on. Victoria returned to her projections, but the numbers swam before her eyes, refusing to come into focus. That evening, she attended a private dinner party in Brooklyn Heights, a converted brownstone where artists and tech entrepreneurs mingled in studied casualness that probably required more effort than the gala's formal elegance. The host, a gallery owner named Julian, had recently adopted a rescue dog, some kind of pit bull mix with scars across its muzzle and a tendency to lean against people's legs as if seeking constant reassurance that it wouldn't be hurt again. "This is Stella," Julian introduced the dog with obvious pride. "She was used as bait in a fighting ring. Can you imagine? But look at her now, absolutely transformed." Victoria observed the dog skeptically. It seemed nervous, damaged, the kind of creature that required constant attention and emotional labor, hardly worth the investment. "Why would you take on something like that?" Victoria asked, genuinely puzzled. Julian's expression softened. "Because someone had to. And because she's taught me more about resilience and forgiveness in 3 months than I learned in 40 years of being human." Other guests murmured agreement, sharing their own rescue stories, but Victoria remained silent. She left early, claiming morning obligations, and sat in her car for several minutes before instructing Marcus to drive. As Manhattan's lights blurred past her window, she thought about Julian's words: resilience, forgiveness, lessons from a damaged dog. The concepts felt foreign, almost laughable. Victoria had built her success on never forgiving weakness, never showing resilience in the face of difficulty, but rather crushing it beneath her heel. And yet somewhere in the city, a stray dog with amber eyes was demonstrating both those qualities simply by surviving another day. The thought disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Friday brought the first crack in Victoria's carefully constructed reality. Her assistant, Emily, a 26-year-old woman who had worked tirelessly for 3 years with barely a thank you, handed in her resignation. Victoria stared at the letter as if it were written in a foreign language. "You're leaving for Thompson's firm," Victoria said flatly. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Actually, I'm leaving to volunteer in Peru for 6 months. Then I'll figure out what comes next." Victoria's expression cycled through disbelief to contempt. "You're throwing away your career to play savior in South America? That's the most naive thing I've ever heard." Emily's response was quiet, but firm. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm saving myself before this job turns me into someone I don't recognize anymore." She left without another word, and Victoria sat alone in her office, the resignation letter still in her hand, feeling something uncomfortably close to shame. That evening, instead of attending her usual Friday night obligations, Victoria told Marcus to drive without destination. They ended up downtown, near the boutique where she'd first seen the stray. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was tired and needed to rest, but she found herself searching the sidewalks nonetheless. There, in the same spot, as if he'd been waiting, sat Chance. "Stop the car," she ordered. Marcus complied, surprised. Victoria stepped out into the autumn cold, her cashmere coat billowing around her, and approached the dog. Chance watched her with those unnerving amber eyes, alert but not aggressive. They regarded each other for a long moment. Wealth and poverty, privilege and survival, two beings who lived in the same city but might as well have inhabited different planets. Victoria noticed things she hadn't before. The way the dog held his injured ear, slightly cocked, as if still listening for danger. The careful intelligence in his gaze, assessing whether she was threat or possibility. The fact that despite his obvious hunger, he didn't beg or grovel. He simply existed with a dignity that her $8 million deal couldn't purchase. She reached into her bag, her mess, worth more than most people's cars, and pulled out the remainder of her lunch from the city's most exclusive restaurant. Seared tuna, probably $40 for the portion she hadn't finished. She held it out, then hesitated. To feed him would be to acknowledge him. To acknowledge him would be to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, the hierarchy she'd constructed wasn't as absolute as she'd believed. Her hand trembled slightly. Then she placed the container on the ground and stepped back. Chance approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, and began to eat. Victoria stood there in the cold, watching a stray dog consume a meal that cost more than many families' grocery budgets, and felt something crack open inside her chest, something frightening and overwhelming and utterly beyond her control. "Mrs. Ashford," Marcus's voice held concern. She realized she'd been standing there for nearly 10 minutes. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the lie so practiced it emerged without thought. But as she returned to the car and watched Chance finish his meal, she knew nothing would ever be quite fine again. The carefully constructed walls she'd built between herself and the world suffering had developed their first fracture. What she didn't know was that fractures, once started, tend to spread, and sometimes they spread with catastrophic speed. Sunday afternoon arrived with deceptive normalcy. Clear skies, moderate traffic, the kind of autumn day when Manhattan almost felt peaceful. Victoria had spent the morning reviewing contracts in her penthouse, declined 3 social invitations, and finally decided to drive to her New Hamptons property to inspect the renovations. Marcus had the day off, so she would drive herself, an unusual choice, but one that suited her mood. The Mercedes handled like a dream, responsive and powerful, an extension of her will. She took the Midtown Tunnel, heading toward the Long Island Expressway, her mind occupied with details of the renovation. The kitchen needed to be redone entirely. The master bathroom's marble was the wrong shade. The landscaping required complete replacement. Everything could be perfected with enough money and determination. She was approximately 20 minutes outside the city when she smelled it, a faint burning odor, like overheated electronics or scorched plastic. Victoria frowned, checking her dashboard. No warning lights. The smell intensified slightly, but seemed to dissipate when she opened the windows. Probably something on the road, debris burning off someone else's exhaust. She continued driving. 5 miles later, smoke began seeping from beneath the hood. Victoria's heart rate accelerated as she immediately signaled and pulled onto the shoulder, her training in crisis management kicking in automatically. She grabbed her phone, her bag, reached for the door handle, and found it wouldn't open. The electronic locks had malfunctioned, trapping her inside as smoke began billowing into the cabin. Panic, real, primal panic, flooded her system. She tried the window controls, but the entire electrical system had failed. The smoke thickened, acrid and choking. She could hear a crackling sound now, see actual flames beginning to lick from beneath the hood. Her expensive car had become a metal coffin, and the wealth that had always protected her from every inconvenience suddenly meant nothing at all. Victoria tried to kick out the window, but the safety glass held. She pounded on it with her fists, screaming, though traffic roared past without stopping, everyone in their own insulated worlds, unable or unwilling to see her distress. The smoke was overwhelming now, burning her lungs, making her vision blur. She thought of her empire, her achievements, her carefully controlled existence, and realized with crystalline clarity that none of it mattered. She was going to die here, alone, choking on smoke while strangers drove past. Her consciousness began to fade, grey spots dancing across her vision. She slumped against the door, still conscious enough to feel the heat intensifying, to understand that the flames would reach her soon. In that moment between awareness and oblivion, she thought of Emily's resignation, of Julian's rescue dog, of the stray with amber eyes who survived on scraps and still had the grace to accept kindness without shame. Then through the smoke and fading consciousness, she saw something impossible, a shape moving along the shoulder, running toward her car with purposeful determination. At first she thought it was hallucination, her oxygen-starved brain conjuring rescue fantasies, but the shape resolved into solid reality, brown and tan, matted fur, one torn ear, amber eyes reflecting the growing flames. The stray dog. Chance. Here on the expressway, miles from his downtown territory, appearing like something conjured from desperation and hope, he circled the car once, assessing, then leapt against Victoria's window, barking frantically. A truck slowed, then another. Chance's commotion was impossible to ignore, a living alarm system demanding attention in a way Victoria's trapped silence could not. A man jumped from the truck, took in the situation instantly. Trapped woman, electrical fire, seconds before catastrophe. He grabbed a tire iron from his vehicle and shattered Victoria's window in 3 powerful swings. Smoke poured out in a choking cloud. The man reached in, unlocked the manual release, and dragged Victoria from the car just as flames engulfed the front cabin entirely. She collapsed on the grass shoulder, coughing violently. Her designer clothes scorched and ruined, her perfectly styled hair filled with soot and glass fragments. Emergency vehicles were approaching, their sirens wailing. The man who saved her was calling 911, giving details. And there, sitting calmly beside her as if he'd always been there, was Chance. Their eyes met again, wealth and poverty, privilege and survival, but this time, everything had changed. This time, Victoria understood that hierarchy was an illusion, that worth could not be measured in pedigree or profit margins, and that the creature she had dismissed as worthless had just proven more valuable than anything in her entire empire. She reached out with a trembling, soot-covered hand and touched the matted fur of his head. He didn't pull away. The last thing Victoria saw before the paramedics arrived was Chance's amber eyes, watching her with something that might have been concern, might have been recognition, might have been forgiveness. Victoria woke in a hospital room, painted that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper, every breath a reminder of the smoke she'd inhaled. An IV dripped steadily into her arm, and monitoring equipment beeped with mechanical indifference. She was alive, though her survival still felt surreal, like a story that had happened to someone else. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, explained the situation with professional detachment. Smoke inhalation, minor burns on her hands, shock and dehydration. She would recover fully with rest. The Mercedes was a total loss, the cause likely an electrical fault in the recently installed custom sound system. Luxury, it turned out, was no guarantee of safety. "You're very lucky," the doctor said. "The driver who pulled you out said a dog alerted him to your situation. Otherwise, he might have driven past like everyone else. You owe that animal your life." Victoria nodded mutely, still processing. A nurse arrived with paperwork. Her assistant appeared with concern and logistics, and soon the room filled with the administrative debris of near death. Insurance forms, police reports, concerned phone calls from acquaintances who'd heard the news. But Victoria's thoughts remained fixed on a single question. Where was Chance? The truck driver who'd saved her, a man named Robert Shen, as it turned out, visited that evening and provided details. The dog had stayed by Victoria's side until the ambulance arrived, then disappeared into the nearby woods before anyone could secure him. Animal control had been called, but the stray had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. "I don't understand," Victoria said, her damaged voice barely above a whisper. "We were miles from downtown. How could he have been there?" Robert shrugged. "Dogs do things we can't explain sometimes. Maybe he was traveling, maybe coincidence, maybe something more. My grandmother used to say that some animals carry old souls, that they show up exactly when they're needed." Victoria, who had built a career on data and logic, found herself accepting this mystical non-answer, because the alternative, pure, random chance, seemed somehow more unbelievable than the possibility that a stray dog she'd fed once had tracked her scent for miles and appeared at the exact moment she needed salvation. She was released the next morning with instructions to rest and follow up in a week. Her penthouse felt simultaneously familiar and alien, as if she'd been gone for years instead of hours. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The expensive furniture, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering views that real estate agents called priceless. But Victoria looked at it all and felt nothing except a hollow awareness of absence. That night, unable to sleep, she did something she'd never done in her carefully curated existence. She Googled how to find a stray dog. The results overwhelmed her. Shelters, rescue organizations, lost and found pet databases, advice about search patterns and scent trails. She began calling animal shelters in the counties surrounding the expressway, describing Chance in detail: the matted coat, the torn ear, the amber eyes. Most shelters took her information politely, but offered little hope. Stray dogs were everywhere. Without a chip or collar, identification was nearly impossible. One shelter worker, kinder than the rest, suggested she try visiting in person. "Dogs remember people," the woman said. "If he's here and he knows you, he'll react. Sometimes that's the only way to identify them." So began Victoria Ashford's transformation from someone who avoided dirt at all costs to someone who spent her days visiting animal shelters across 3 counties. She walked through kennels filled with barking, desperate animals, pit bulls with scarred faces, elderly labs with clouded eyes, puppies wild with energy, dogs of every imaginable mixture sitting in concrete runs, hoping for someone to see value in them. Each visit broke something in her heart and rebuilt it slightly differently. She saw the shelter workers, underpaid, overworked people, who showed more compassion in an hour than Victoria had demonstrated in her entire adult life. She witnessed adoptions that made her cry, and euthanasia lists that made her rage against the unfairness of a world where worth was measured in desirability rather than intrinsic value. But she didn't find Chance. Days turned to weeks. Her colleagues began suggesting gently that she needed to return to work, to accept that the dog had moved on, that life must continue. Victoria heard their concerns and ignored them. For the first time in her meticulously controlled existence, profit margins and portfolio performance seemed trivial compared to the urgent need to find the creature who had saved her life. On the 15th day of her search, a shelter in Suffolk County called. They had a dog matching her description, brought in by a highway patrol officer who'd found him wandering near the expressway. No chip, no collar, aggressive toward other dogs, but oddly gentle with humans. They could hold him for 3 days before he'd be evaluated for placement or euthanasia. Victoria made the drive in a rented car, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The shelter was located in an industrial area, a cinder-block building surrounded by chain-link fencing. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner barely masked the underlying scent of too many animals in too small a space. The shelter worker led her to the back kennels, to a run in the corner where a brown and tan dog lay curled against the wall. "That's him," Victoria whispered. At the sound of her voice, Chance raised his head. Their eyes met. Amber and brown, recognition passing between them like an electrical current. He stood, approached the gate, and pressed his nose through the chain link. Victoria knelt in the concrete aisle, heedless of her pants, and reached through to touch his muzzle. "I've been looking for you," she said, tears streaming down her face for the first time in decades. Chance's tail wagged slowly, tentatively, as if he couldn't quite believe this moment was real. The shelter worker watched silently, recognizing something profound, though she couldn't have named it. This wasn't just a woman reclaiming a pet. This was redemption, wearing fur, and carrying the weight of lessons humans spend lifetimes learning. Adopting Chance required paperwork, fees, and a home inspection. Bureaucratic hurdles that Victoria, accustomed to moving billions with phone calls, found simultaneously frustrating and strangely grounding. Her penthouse, with its glass and marble and complete absence of anything resembling dog-friendly space, required sudden and dramatic transformation. The interior designer she'd used for years arrived, took one look at Chance, and immediately began sketching modifications. "We'll need non-slip flooring in the main areas, a proper feeding station, window guards for safety, and honestly some furniture that won't show fur. Also, that white carpet has to go." Victoria, who had once fired an employee for suggesting her aesthetic choices weren't practical, simply nodded and approved everything. More challenging than physical changes was Chance's integration into her life. The dog, who had survived on streets and scraps, found the penthouse overwhelming. Too much space, too many reflective surfaces, sounds that echoed strangely. He spent the first 3 days hiding in the corner of Victoria's bedroom, accepting food but refusing to relax, his amber eyes tracking her movements with wary uncertainty. Victoria, who had never demonstrated patience with anything that didn't produce immediate results, discovered reserves of gentleness she didn't know she possessed. She sat on the floor near Chance's corner for hours, reading quarterly reports aloud in a soft voice, offering treats without expectation, simply being present. Slowly, incrementally, the dog's tension eased. By the end of the first week, he'd moved from the corner to a dog bed beside her chair. By the second week, his head rested on her foot while she worked. The transformation worked in both directions. Victoria's colleagues noticed immediate changes. She arrived at meetings slightly late. Because Chance needed walking, she declined evening obligations because the dog was still adjusting. She spoke about things beyond profit margins and market trends. Her assistant, Emily's replacement, remarked that Victoria actually smiled now, genuinely, not the professional grimace she'd perfected for clients. But deeper changes were occurring beneath the surface. Victoria began questioning decisions she'd made automatically for decades. When presented with a hostile takeover opportunity that would net millions but cost hundreds of jobs, she hesitated. When a commercial property became available in a low-income neighborhood, she researched community needs before developing it into luxury condos. The ruthless clarity that had built her empire was being complicated by something she'd long dismissed as weakness: empathy. Her therapist, during their next session, raised eyebrows at the visible changes. "You're different," she observed. "More present, less defended." Victoria laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "I'm being psychologically analyzed by a dog." The therapist didn't smile. "Perhaps the dog is simply reflecting back what you've always had the capacity to be. Animals don't require us to be perfect. They require us to be genuine." 1 month after bringing Chance home, Victoria returned to the downtown neighborhood where she'd first encountered him. The boutique, the bodega, the spot where he'd sat with quiet dignity while she'd dismissed him as worthless. She brought Chance with her, Walking instead of driving, experiencing the city from street level instead of through tinted car windows. The bodega owner recognized them both and emerged with a broad smile. "You found him. I wondered what happened to that one." He was always different, never caused trouble, just survived. Victoria purchased water for Chance and found herself staying to talk, learning about the man's family, his dreams of expanding the business, the neighborhood's challenges and strengths. Conversations she would have dismissed as waste of time now felt essential, like learning a language she'd never bothered to study. They walked for hours, Victoria and Chance, retracing the dog's former territory. She saw the city through new eyes. Not the Manhattan of luxury she'd always inhabited, but the version that existed alongside it, parallel and mostly invisible to people like her. The homeless veteran who slept in the subway entrance, the single mother working 2 jobs at the diner, the elderly man who fed pigeons from a bench. All survivors, all navigating their own versions of the streets Chance had once walked alone. That evening, Victoria made a series of phone calls. To Sarah Chen, the program director from the charity gala, offering not just money, but active participation in the companion animal program. To Julian, the gallery owner, asking for introduction to other rescue advocates. To her attorney, instructing him to establish a foundation specifically for animal welfare and supporting humans experiencing homelessness with their pets. Chance watched all this from his bed, his amber eyes intelligent and calm, as if he'd known all along that she had this capacity for change. Victoria looked at him and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Gratitude not for what someone could do for her, but for what they'd revealed about herself. "Thank you," she said simply. Chance's tail thumped once against the floor. It was enough. 6 months after the fire, Victoria's life bore little resemblance to the carefully controlled empire she'd once commanded. She still ran her investment firm, still closed deals and managed portfolios, but the ruthless efficiency had been tempered by something that might have been wisdom, or might simply have been humanity, finally allowed to emerge from its long hibernation. The foundation she'd established, named Second Chance, an obvious choice that made her smile every time she said it, had opened its first shelter in Brooklyn, a facility that housed both homeless individuals and their companion animals. The model was revolutionary. People could receive housing assistance, job training and health care while keeping their pets, the very animals who often provided the only stable relationship in chaotic lives. Victoria attended the opening ceremony, wearing jeans and a sweater, Chance by her side, wearing a service vest that identified him as a therapy dog. He'd proven remarkably suited for the work, calm with children, gentle with the elderly, somehow intuitive about who needed comfort most. Watching him interact with the shelter's first residents, Victoria understood that his years on the street hadn't hardened him. They'd taught him empathy that came from shared experience. Sarah Chen, now the foundation's director, approached with a young woman in tow. "Victoria, this is Amanda. She's one of our first residents. She has someone she'd like you to meet." Amanda, perhaps 25, with eyes that had seen too much too soon, knelt down and a scruffy terrier mix emerged from behind her legs. "This is lucky," Amanda said softly. "If it wasn't for your program, I would have had to choose between keeping him and getting housing. Now I don't have to choose." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, still an unfamiliar sensation, though it happened more frequently now. "I'm glad you're both here," she managed. Amanda smiled, the expression transforming her worn face. "Everybody needs somebody who won't give up on them. Lucky taught me that. I guess Chance taught you the same thing." It was the most accurate assessment anyone had ever made of Victoria's transformation. The foundation expanded rapidly. Within a year, they'd opened 3 more facilities across the tri-state area, each one designed with input from the people they served rather than imposed from above. Victoria discovered that the skills she'd used to build corporate empires translated remarkably well to social entrepreneurship, especially when combined with humility and genuine curiosity about others' experiences. Her personal life transformed as well. The penthouse was sold, too impersonal, too isolated, and replaced with a brownstone in Brooklyn, with a small yard where Chance could lie in the sun. Victoria learned to cook simple meals instead of ordering from Michelin-starred restaurants. She made friends based on shared values rather than business utility. She dated occasionally, though she joked that Chance was a tough act to follow in terms of loyalty and emotional intelligence. Her former colleagues watched these changes with bewilderment. Some dismissed it as a midlife crisis, a temporary aberration before she'd return to her ruthless former self. Others recognized something more profound, a fundamental reorientation of priorities, a redemption arc that seemed impossible for someone as calcified in their ways as Victoria had been. But those closest to her understood that Chance hadn't changed Victoria. He'd revealed who she might have been all along if fear hadn't built such impenetrable walls around her heart. 2 years after the fire, Victoria received an invitation to speak at a national conference on homelessness and companion animals. She stood before hundreds of advocates, policymakers and researchers, Chance lying calmly at her feet, and told her story without embellishment or self-aggrandizement. She spoke about privilege and prejudice, about a dog she'd dismissed as worthless saving her life, about learning that value cannot be measured in pedigrees or portfolios. "I thought I knew what success meant," she concluded. "I thought it was about accumulation, of wealth, of power, of control. But Chance taught me that real success is about connection, about seeing value where others see waste, about understanding that the hierarchy we construct is an illusion designed to protect us from the truth. We're all just surviving, doing our best with whatever resources we have. Some of us have penthouses, some have underpasses. But we all need the same things: safety, dignity, someone who won't abandon us when things get hard." The applause was thunderous. Afterward, dozens of people approached to share their own stories of redemption, of animals who'd saved them, of second chances that transformed everything. Victoria listened to each one, Chance greeting everyone with patient kindness, and understood that this connection, this shared vulnerability, was what she'd been missing during all those years of carefully maintained isolation. That evening, back in the brownstone, Victoria and Chance sat in the small yard as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. She ran her hand over his head, noting the grey now threading through his muzzle, the slight stiffness in his hindquarters that spoke of age, catching up to his hard-lived years. He wouldn't be with her forever. Nothing was forever. But this moment, this peaceful, ordinary moment, contained more value than all the millions she'd accumulated in her previous life. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Not just from the fire, from myself." Chance's amber eyes met hers with that familiar intelligence, and she could have sworn she saw understanding there, maybe even forgiveness for the person she'd been when they first met. The city hummed around them, sirens and traffic, voices and music, the eternal symphony of 8 million souls trying to survive and occasionally, miraculously, connecting across the vast distances that separated them. Victoria had once viewed that distance as necessary, as protection. Now she understood it as the thing she needed to bridge, one relationship, one moment of genuine connection at a time. Chance rested his head on her knee, content. The stray, who'd been dismissed as useless, had taught a wealthy woman about true worth. The dog who'd survived on scraps had demonstrated grace under pressure that no amount of money could buy. And the person who'd thought herself above compassion had learned that the greatest luxury wasn't isolation from suffering, but the privilege of helping alleviate it. In the end, it wasn't a story about a dog saving a woman from a fire. It was a story about 2 survivors who found each other exactly when they needed to most, and built something from that meeting that neither could have created alone. A life defined not by what they'd escaped, but by what they chose to become. The stars emerged, invisible to most of the city, but visible here in this small yard. Victoria looked up at them, chance warm against her leg, and felt something she'd never experienced in her penthouse, her corner office, or any of the spaces where she'd once measured her success. She felt home, and that, more than any rescue or redemption, was the greatest miracle of all. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on the invisible souls around you, the strays, the dismissed, the overlooked who carry more value than their circumstances suggest. Have you ever judged someone or something based on appearance rather than essence? This story reminds us that heroes don't always wear crowns. Sometimes they wear matted fur and amber eyes. If this tale touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that second chances exist for everyone, and redemption often arrives from the most unexpected places. Subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know about worth, survival, and the transformative power of unconditional love. And if you can, visit your local shelter. The life you save might not be theirs,